So welcome to Life on Record. I'm here with Marietjie Venter, and we're going to be discussing all things viruses related to horses. Obviously, it's been a really wet season, and we've had a huge number of horses down with an array of viruses. But before we get into that, tell me a bit about you. And obviously, you've done a lot of research into viruses, especially West now, as well as AHS. So credentials, please.
Hi, Siobhan. Thank you very much. It's very exciting to talk to you, like always. So I'm a medical virologist, but I work on diseases that goes between animals and humans, and so which you call One Health. Okay, so West Nile specifically is a zoonotic disease, and humans can also get it. African horse sickness virus is not. It's specifically an animal disease. But being a horse owner, you know,
Yes.
we've all come across it a lot. I did my master's degree on horse sickness many years ago on recombinant vaccine development. And then, so over the years, since probably 2006, we started the surveillance program basically in South Africa because we were interested in West Nile. And so we set up a study where we will look for neurological disease in horses, because horses is basically imported species to South Africa. So any horse would be susceptible to West Nile. There's no genetic immunity because they've been here for a long time. So when we started investigating West Nile in humans, we thought looking at horses would be a good way to trace it, because they get very sick. They get very severe neurological disease, and about 90% of symptomatic cases in horses will have neurological disease. So when we started the study, we basically asked the vets to just send us neurological cases, and we will see if we can find West Nile, and we very quickly found it.
A lot.
Yeah, but then what happens though, these viruses co-circulate during the season. And so you will detect a whole lot of viruses that co-circulate together. And then, so you can't only look for West Nile. But once again, working with horses during the season, you will then come across horse sickness as well.
Okay.
So I've worked very closely with the group that works on African horse sickness, such as Alan Guthrie and so on, over the years. And so I have a good understanding of West Nile and have the same concerns as all the other horse owners
out there.
Yeah.
So I think our three big sort of viruses that we see at this time of year, we get EEV, we get West Nile, and we get AHS.
Yeah, so there's a whole range of others as well. And so African horse sickness and EEV is transmitted by colicoidal midges, like you know. And so the horse is actually the reservoir. So the natural reservoir is zebras and donkeys, and they don't get sick. So normally in the old days, they were really seen as the amplifying host. But then zebras moved across South Africa, so they didn't have to come in from the north anymore.
Yes.
And now basically, these reservoirs all over the country where you can get amplification. But once horses are infected, a horse is actually the amplification host. So if there's enough virus in the horses, we just picks it up from horses and can spread it. You don't need that reservoir anymore.
Okay.
While West Nile is transmitted by mosquitoes. And so there's a couple of viruses transmitted by mosquitoes at the same time. So it's West Nile, then Synbus virus, Middelburg virus, Shuni virus is the ones that we defined as the most common in South Africa, being transmitted by mosquitoes. But they all co-circulate at the same time. So encephalosis is family to horse sickness.
Okay.
It's also orbivirus, so they're both called orbiviruses. And it's normally milder than African horse sickness, but it's the same midges that carry it. So in the same season, same midges and the same areas, you'll find it.
So just looking between those viruses, what are our main sort of symptoms? You know, and then the question I want off that as well is, how do we test and when do we test? Because I've heard some people saying if you test too early, you might get a false negative. So at what point, you know, if your horse is symptomatic, let's say I go down to my stables this morning, I've got a horse with an elevated temp over 39.5. What sort of steps would you go then? Obviously, I mean, it's been a crazy season.
Yeah. So there's some of the symptoms that sort of look similar. So firstly, if you find a fever, it can be the beginning of any of these infections. Okay. Horse sickness, as you know, can be a pulmonary disease or then a cardiac disease.
Yeah, so Dikkop and Dinkop.
Yeah, so Dikkop and Dinkop. And so it looks different to West Nile. West Nile is neurological signs. So it starts also sometimes as a fever, but often the fever is not as pronounced as what you get with encephalosis and horse sickness. But then after that, the horses become severely neurological. So the first symptoms is what we call ataxia. It means they're sort of stumbling. They are not steady on the legs.
So that they lack coordination.
Yeah. But then later on, they can get back and front leg paralysis. And so some of these horses get seizures, can be very severe. So horses recover of that. So horse sickness, the fatality rate is anything between 50% and 95%. For West Nile and these other viruses, we found that about 90% of them may have neurological signs, but the fatality rate is about 35%.
Okay, so
which
it's a little
in
bit
human
lower.
terms is massive.
Yes.
None of these viruses that we worry about every day has near that type of fatality, but it's lower than West Nile, than African horse sickness. So the way that a virus infection works, initially when you get infected or the horse gets infected, the virus starts replicating. So after like a week, you actually now get
symptoms almost.
Yeah, you start getting symptoms, but it's when the virus levels is high enough as well.
Okay.
So when you see fever initially, it's actually the best time to take a sample because we test by PCR.
Okay.
And so your PCR test needs virus to be present.
Okay.
So early on in the infection, it may increase a little bit, but West Nile, for example, is only like about 2 days that you can detect the virus. And then it's actually the immune response that makes the animal sick.
Okay.
And so for horse sickness, it has a longer time that you can detect virus with PCR than West Nile. But it's good to have a specimen, in the beginning when they actually start showing symptoms. If you do a serological assay, you need to wait a little bit. But that's why I don't wait with the idea that I will later get a sample because then it may not be PCR positive anymore. So we take one as soon as the animal actually shows symptoms and becomes sick. And then later on, like a week later, you can then take another sample, which will actually show IgM. So IgM is the antibodies that the animal develops once they see the virus for the first time and becomes sick. Yeah.
And they reacted. Okay, so with those, obviously, I think we've got vaccinations for AHS and we've got vaccinations for West Nile.
Yeah.
So no vaccination for EEV though.
Yeah. So there's no
and that's not covered by the AHS vaccine. Yeah. So how does the AHS vaccine work and when is the best time to give it? Obviously, I know there's the recommendation between 1 June and October to do it. But as a rider, I think sometimes we find it a bit challenging between shows, and then also vaccine availability can sometimes lend into that. What is the best time to vaccinate? Because obviously we're now in the middle of April and we're seeing a lot of cases. How long on we'll do West Nile next, but on the AHS, how long is the horse covered for? Like if I think in human terms, if I go get a flu vaccine, I get it before flu season to cover me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I wouldn't go and get one in December.
Yeah. So African horse sickness virus vaccine is a live vaccine. And so a live vaccine in general gives you a much stronger immune response than a dead vaccine.
Okay.
So it's one of the pros, but also there is some disadvantages as well. But if you vaccinate, theoretically the immunity should last almost a year.
Okay.
But it doesn't.
Okay.
So it depends what, not all animals will have the same level of immunity to all the different serotypes. And so the best is basically to have protection by the time that cases would have started.
Okay.
And so the problem at the moment, with warmer temperatures and longer rainy seasons and so on, that season sometimes moves earlier.
Yes.
So we know now, you start seeing cases sometimes in November, or even earlier sometimes.
Yeah.
And so your horse should be protected before the midge season really takes off. But horse sickness cases normally, it really takes off in January to June.
Yes.
So before that time, your horse needs to be vaccinated and protected. So the recommendations that you must vaccinate before the end of October is because that's really when there's lots of midges around.
Yeah.
And you don't want, basically the vaccine to be picked up by midges and
so that's the thing, you get a vaccine outbreak or
so I'll get to that now, but you basically want to make sure that your horse is protected before that time.
Okay.
And so people that really wait to December, it may be too late.
Okay.
At that time you can already start seeing horse sickness cases, and as you know, there's 2 vaccines, and you have to wait at least 3 weeks in between. So it basically, if you work it out, you need like 2 months to develop your immunity, and so you need to do that early enough that will happen. 3 weeks apart, you can stretch it.
Yeah.
And so personally, what I do is I vaccinate the first time in the end of August, and then I go to my competitions, and then I do the next one right before the end of October.
Okay.
You know, so you can work out your shows that you can still do all of them. And it also then reduces that length of time that your horse stands.
Yeah.
You know?
So just in terms of the standing, and again, I think this is a good question. A lot of people wonder what to do with their horses during sort of when they vaccinate. You know, there's some recommendations. Well, let's give them 6 weeks off. You know, or you know, and I know it's light work in the first week and the last week and the middle week. That's, I think, sometimes a question. I know it's normally the 7th to 10th day where you see sort of if there is going to be a reaction to the vaccine, but then when you want to keep the heart rate lower, that you're not stressing the system.
Yeah, no, but it's exactly that. And so you basically, as I said in the beginning, once you get a virus infection, vaccine is working the same way. But after the first week, your virus levels now actually start picking up.
Okay.
So that's the time, you know, from the end of week 1 to the beginning of week 3. So week 2, you expect to see the highest level of virus before the antibodies now kick in and reduce it again.
Okay.
So that's really the time that you should be careful.
Okay.
So I ride my horses in the first week. I never do any competitions in that all 3 weeks basically of that time. And in the second week, I'll walk my horses. I don't necessarily stop because I personally just find my horses just runs around in the paddock and they
elevate their own heart rate.
Exactly. So it's better for me to sort of keep them just going rather than stop completely. But that's my personal preference. You can stop completely if you're, you know, if that's better for you. But you shouldn't do competitions and so on in that time. That will stress them.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, like I said, it really helps if you can stretch the time between vaccines, because then you don't have a six-week period that you have to rest completely.
Yeah. And then now, which vaccine do you give first? And there's a lot of talk. I know a lot of people like to give the second vaccine first, and then do the first vaccine second. I got that right.
Yeah. So there's been some research around that. Okay. And so there was a time where they saw some cases that actually was, you know, horses that had severe vaccine reaction. And in that time, they isolated virus from horses that became sick of the vaccine. And what they saw is the first vaccine is serotype 1, 3, and 4, I think.
Yes.
And so after the first vaccine, when the horses got the second vaccine, they found at the end of that period when they became sick, they found horse sickness free in the sick horses, which is supposed to be gone now.
Yes.
Okay. And so what they think happens is that it actually reassorts, and then you get a vaccine reaction to the first one.
Okay.
And it's because that strain is more pathogenic.
Okay.
Okay. And so if you give the second one first, so the second batch, which is in the maybe. I talk under correction. I can't remember now, but I think it's so 5 is not in the vaccine. So I think it's 6, 7, and 9 maybe, but maybe
we'll check that.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so if you give that one first, the immune response actually, these are weaker strains. So it takes a time to clear the virus. Now you give the second one, and then the chance of reactions is lower.
Okay.
So that's where there's some science behind it. Yes. It wasn't just decided.
Someone didn't come up with it on the fly.
And so, especially for young horses that would be more prone to vaccine reactions, it's a good idea.
And even imported horses, I suppose, as well.
Yeah.
Or horses from Cape Town.
Yeah, I prefer to do that. But I have found that not all vets are really keen to it, because sometimes I get, not the vet, maybe the vet and the owner got confused. And I did have 1 year where the vet accidentally gave it again the same bottle. So if you do that, it's just extremely important that it's actually recorded properly.
Yes.
And that they take note, and you know, so that it's just a controlled system. But it's very commonly done now.
Okay.
It hasn't been updated by OVP. I personally think it would help if they do. Just make the recommendation. There's enough science that's behind it, but it will have to, you know, they'll have to change the registrations and things like that. So that's probably why they.
It's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah.
So why isn't strain 5 covered?
So when they developed the vaccine back in the 70s, the way that they produced the vaccine strains, basically, you attenuate them. It basically means you pass them either in mice, which they did back then, or in cell culture,
Okay.
and that then induces a couple of mutations that makes the virus weak.
Okay.
And so what happened with serotype 5, that strain was still passage in mice brain, and so it became neuroinvasive basically.
Okay.
And so there was horses that developed neurological signs, and so they removed it off from the vaccine completely.
Okay.
But it was never replaced.
Okay.
You know, so basically that should have been done. They should have replaced that strain with a new. So the current strains are all adapted in cell culture, not in mouse brain anymore.
Okay.
And so they should have done that. There should have been a new adapted one in cell culture, but it was never done. And so often now what happens is you get some of the outbreaks that would be serotype 5 that's not covered.
Okay. And so is there a way, obviously you said you do the PCR test, then with horse sickness, is there data in that to show what strains are prevalent in a year?
Yeah,
do they strain test essentially?
Yeah, so they can subtype them to determine which ones are circulating. It's not something that's done routinely for diagnostics, but it's something that if you send it to ERC or to OBR even, as part of their epidemiology investigations for the year, they'll subtype to see what strains is going around.
Okay.
And so there was actually a publication recently where they looked at horses that received the vaccine and became sick, and horses that were unvaccinated and became sick.
Okay.
And there's about an 8 times higher chance of dying for horses that didn't have the vaccine.
Oh, wow.
So even though we know that sometimes horses, still become sick, it really protects them from death.
Yes.
So there are cases, I know, there are people that will tell you they've had cases of fatal horse sickness in well-vaccinated and documented horses. But in general, your chance is 8 times less that your horse will die if it had been vaccinated.
So probably a good idea to vaccinate.
And
now on the West Nile vaccine, how does that work?
So the West Nile vaccine is an inactivated vaccine.
Okay.
And so it has a couple of things that makes it easier. Then you can actually vaccinate anytime.
Okay.
West Nile cases is also a arbovirus, which means it's an arthropod-borne virus, so it's mosquitoes. And the mosquito levels also increase basically by sort of the rainy season. So by December, you'll start getting lots of mosquitoes, but the mosquitoes aren't fed yet. So they, the difference between the epidemiology of West Nile and horse sickness, for example, is that birds carry West Nile.
Oh, wow.
And so they bring West Nile in every year, and they basically then circulate, and then mosquitoes, once the levels is high enough, they start feeding on the birds. And then when the mosquito is infected and bite your horse or you can get West Nile.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the difference is basically then also that humans and horses don't have very high levels of virus in their blood. So remember I told you it's like 2 days that you can actually detect it with PCR. So it clears very quickly, and even in those 2 days, the level of virus in the blood is not high enough to be picked up by a mosquito again. And so the vaccine is dead. Okay, so there's 2 vaccines. The one is a inactivated vaccine, which basically just means they grew up the virus and they added formalin and they inactivated the virus. The other one is a recombinant virus, so it's a canary pox, which can't replicate in horses. And it was adapted as well, so it can also not replicate in birds. But then they cloned the gene that is a protective antigen, so it's the surface protein of West Nile, into this, and that basically formed a recombinant vaccine. So, but it's a virus that can't replicate, and it's just part of the vaccine or part of the virus. So you can't get West Nile off that. So if you ever see some sort of reaction to West Nile, it's immune mediated. So, so it may be an immune response that you see. But the advantage of that is that you can basically vaccinate anytime. But the same thing, you want to vaccinate before the season.
So probably like November time, October, November, somewhere around there.
Yeah. So we do see some cases earlier on, but most of it is after that. So I combine it with the time that I do horse sickness. So I'll do my first horse sickness vaccines, like I said, maybe end of August. Then I'll do a West Nile, and then after that I'll do the second one. But you can do it later as well. So, and if you're not vaccinated and there's really a very significant outbreak here, you can vaccinate anytime. So the only difference, you have the first year you have to give a booster. So you give the first vaccine, and then also 3 weeks later a booster. But then after that you just vaccinate annually.
So obviously we spoke now about the difference between sort of live and dead vaccines. There are other vaccines that have been spoken about for AHS, the CVRL1, which is a dead vaccine that I think was created in Dubai, but it's not been tested.
Yeah, so, the reason that it's not here is basically just that it hasn't been registered here. Okay, in order to get it registered, either the company, so the people that developed it, or a company that picks it up, have to come and ask to register it here and provide the information that shows it's as protective or better than the current
OBP
vaccine.
one, yeah.
And that hasn't been done yet. If you go and read up a little bit about the vaccine, so they developed it by, activating all 9 serotypes. So it sounds like all 9 serotypes is in the vaccine. But the way that they did the vaccine trials, they worked with Kenya and then in the United Arab Emirates as well, which I assume probably in Dubai. But what they did is they vaccinated horses in the desert, so that they sort of isolated. And there's no horse sickness in Dubai. Okay, so they couldn't challenge them. So they worked with Kenya, and then they also did a field trial where they vaccinated horses and then left them in an endemic area and see if they got infected.
Okay.
And of their horses, 10% actually became sick. So they didn't die, they weren't severely sick, but 10% of the vaccinated horses had fevers.
Okay.
And so you shouldn't assume that
it's better.
there's going to be nothing. And that was in 50 horses.
Okay.
So they don't have a challenge study where they took all 9 serotypes and challenged these horses and could show that they were basically protected against all 9 serotypes. So you don't really know which of those horses had been infected by which serotype now, and which were protected against what. And so that data would probably need to be a bit better. Or if it's if it's used here, what may be a good option is if there's a vaccine regimen where you have the first dose with the OBP vaccine and then have that as boosters. But all of that needs to be tested.
Yeah.
And so the question is really, do you want to be the person where they test it on your horse?
Yes.
Are you going to take the chance? We don't really know that it would be better. South Africans typically think anything that we don't have must be better, which is not true. So there was previously that DSA vaccine as well.
Yes.
And that was a similar story. So horse owners were really used as the guinea pigs. That vaccine had not been tested formally where there's vaccine trials with data that shows it protects 100% against the disease. Owners were just using it without, it wasn't registered. It was basically used under prescription. Yeah. So it means that you could get it from a vet. Some people, sounded like they got it directly from the distributor, and then they gave it to their horses. And, initially everyone was, this must be better than the OBP vaccine just because it's not the OBP vaccine.
Yeah.
And people's horses died.
Yeah.
And later on, when there were studies done on it by ERC, they, it was quite shaky. They couldn't show some of the viruses present in the vaccine. So, I want to say vaccine for my horses. I want to know it was tested and the horse is going to be safe, not gamble and see maybe it's better or not. So it would be great if they get it registered here, the CVRL vaccine. But we would like to see the data that it's safe. And so after that stage, you will still then have a period where it's now rolled out in the country, and then you will still collect data. So in human vaccines, we do that.
Yeah.
You can't challenge humans with a virus.
Yeah.
So a typical human vaccine is done that way. It's a vaccine trial is basically after you show safety studies, you will then vaccinate a large group of people in an endemic area or during an outbreak such as COVID, and then you determine afterwards, were people protected or not.
That's a whole other topic. I was going to stay away from COVID. So now, what are in terms of, we'll start with AHS, what are the treatments? I mean, there's no sort of wonder drug, give them a shot and they're gonna be all better. And it's a virus, so obviously you can't really treat it with antibiotics.
So just, I have to state I'm not a vet.
Yes.
I'm also not a medical doctor. I'm a medical virologist. And so there's not a specific treatment for horse sickness. It's basically symptomatic treatment, and that's what we have. And unfortunately, that's truth for most viruses.
Yes.
You know, so protect or prevention is much better than cure. That's what it comes down to. So your chance of actually protecting your horse using a vaccine, even if the vaccine is 70% effective and not 100%, it's still much better than trying your luck afterwards. So once the horse is actually sick and infected with horse sickness, you know, to treat it it's luck.
It's a long road as well.
There's at the moment really not anything shown that's worked well, that's proven to have worked. And remember, under a normal condition, 50% of horses would have survived.
Yes.
So if you don't have a very good trial, and you now have, so you often see individuals on Facebook that say, but I treated my horse with this or this, and he survived. How do you know it was that made him survive? Or was the horse lucky enough to have survived the treatment that you gave him?
Well, So, and then for West Nile?
It's the same. So it's like I said, the difference with West Nile, it's immune-mediated problems that you sometimes get. And so for West Nile, the recommendations is really non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. And so they'll give Funestin basically as a treatment. But West Nile, addition to that, the horses become paralyzed often, and so they sling them. And the slinging is basically to prevent them from, getting
collapsing,
or getting other problems of lying down for too long. And they basically then help them through the time that they would be paralyzed, because once they actually get a good immune response and they clear the infection, they may survive. But often the horses panic, and so it's important to keep them calm. So they may give them some calming drugs as well. The same for horse sickness, really.
So, and then obviously now the one question is, AHS is not a notifiable disease.
It is actually notifiable. So it's not controlled in the endemic area. So it's controlled in the export region. So basically in the control and in the surveillance zone and in the clean zone. But it is notifiable. If your horse gets horse sickness, it has to be notified to the state vet. And so it's the responsibility of the owner and the vet that sees the horse to actually report that. And part of that is also that once they know there's an outbreak going on in the area, they try to prevent those horses from moving into the Western Cape.
Would there be benefit on, for example, I live in Chartwell, so we'll use me as an example. I don't want to point fingers at any area. If I had a horse at home with AHS, would it be advisable for me to quarantine my yard?
So that's the recommendation is for the horse to be quarantined. And then the yard, because potentially some of your other horses may be infected without knowing it. And so it's to your benefit and to your neighbor's benefit, firstly, that if you know there's a case, you should notify them. Give them an opportunity to try to protect their horses more. Isolate a horse that's infected basically in a stable there, if you can practice midge control. So both, doing insecticides and what's the other word? So the repellents. So you use both insecticide and repellents. But then you can also cover your stables with some shade cloth and so on. So yes, there is. If there is an infection on a property, that property should actually be quarantined. We know that the thing is, the whole Gauteng is endemic. The whole rest of South Africa basically is endemic. So there's a good chance that there would be other cases around. But those people should not be moving their horses. They basically put all of us at risk. As well.
So I was thinking about it, obviously, because we've had such a bad season. We almost need to look at shifting the show calendar a little bit as well, that when people aren't tempted to sort of go, oh, well, we're just going to go to a show, because again, to your point, it puts everyone else at risk.
So the thing is, in general, if competition horses or if all horses are vaccinated, it reduces the chance of having susceptible animals that gets horse sickness around you, and then increase the level of virus going around. So if horses are infected, the midges will feed on them and transmit it that way. And so even though the vaccine may not prevent it fully, the level of virus in vaccinated horses is much lower. And so at the moment, the problem is that there's too many unvaccinated horses around. So the way to try to reduce this is actually to have all horses vaccinated. At a show, often most of those horses are vaccinated.
Yes.
They can't go to shows if they're not.
Yes.
So the risk is probably lower than in an area where there's no vaccination. But you don't know now, let's say in Kailami, how many people are around you that haven't vaccinated,
Yes.
and midges move over large areas.
Yeah.
So it may be an unvaccinated horse outside of the show.
Yes.
That could be
that's in the area.
The potential source. Yeah.
So now, just speaking about insecticides and repellents, what are good preventative measures? Because I think there's a lot of folk remedies and burning manure and creating a smoked environment.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of nonsense going on as well. Your horse is not going to be protected by ribosity. Even though, maybe you're natural, you may think certain things is natural. There's studies that actually shows that pyrethroids, so those are like cypermethrin,
yes,
is actually a good insecticide for midges and as well as for mosquitoes.
Okay.
And then with repellents, the best one is DEET.
Okay.
And so DEET is Peaceful Sleep, Tabart, or there's several horse-specific products around as well. And so even though those products is specifically made according to the standards that will be safe for your horse as well.
Yeah.
While home mixed stuff, you don't always know what is.
So basically, it's the insecticides and the repellents. So it's cypermethrin and the permethrins and then DEET.
Yeah, and you need to give both.
Okay.
And so the thing is, so DEET is a repellent, and that works well. However, if your horse is bitten, it's not going to kill them.
Yes.
Okay, it's just chasing them away, basically. And so typically those DEET products it lasts for about 8 hours. So if you spray them before they go into the stable till the next morning, and then the next morning again,
spray them again.
But if you have insecticides as well that you can both spray on the animal as well as inside the stables or on your shade cloth in front of your stable doors, that's really what helps as well. I mean, all of us know at the moment there's so many midges around.
Yes.
You can't go out without yours actually being protected.
Yeah. And then what about something like Betacol? Because there's also seems to be a bit of a growing trend of covering your stables in that.
So Betacol is also either a pyrethroid. It's a pyrethrum, as far as I remember. And so yes, it's it was typically used for ticks.
Yeah.
So it is something that will help, but I mean, Betacol it's also quite cheap.
Yeah.
You can make it up, yourself, and it can last for years, and you can spray your own stables.
Yeah.
Anyone can do that, but it should still then be used in combination with a repellent.
Okay.
And so the advantage of having something that you spray on every day is simply that it's always then covered at a certain level. There is an advantage with those tick dips, basically, that it's longer, so you do it once a week. But during the season, you should really be spraying
every day.
Yeah, more.
And then insect coils, UV lights.
So those insect coils, those are actually also, I think it's DEET products, or is it?
Well, it's the human ones.
Yeah, so it's fine. Personally, I'm a bit scared of the fire risk. Seeing that your whole stable is flammable.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of options really at the moment. If you do have electricity in your stable,
and Eskom hasn't cut us off.
Exactly. These products that you buy from Peaceful Sleep or Tabart that you plug in, that's a fluid.
Yes.
That it's a bit safer.
Yeah.
Or these the sprays that you put in.
Yes.
So I have in my stables a couple of sprays in each stable that goes off every 30 minutes.
2 minutes or 3 minutes. Yeah.
So that's an advantage as well. And then smoke. It's sort of an old-fashioned recommendation. There's not a lot of proof that it works. There's not controlled studies that it really works.
Shows anything.
So it's and I mean, horses get pulmonary problems with smoke and so on. So do you really want to have that around?
Yeah.
Some of the older papers also refer to decoy animals. So if for blue tongue outbreaks, for example, which sheep gets, they said you should have cattle.
Okay.
And maybe the midge will rather bite the cattle. But it's sort of midges. It's assuming that they will rather feed on another animal than yours.
Yeah.
It's not enough
It's incentive to buy a llama, to be fair.
Exactly. So it's there, but it's, you know, the basic things are still the best.
And then when, so I've got 2 questions on this. When are midges most active? So anecdotal experience here, again, nothing. I ride really early in the mornings in summer. I generally am on my first horse around 5 a.m. I find there's less midge activity that I can perceive while I'm riding than, for example, at 9 a.m. It seems as everything warms up a little, the midges seem to get a little more active.
Well, traditionally they say it's between dusk and dawn.
Yes.
Okay, so it's from, you know, late afternoon or early morning, midges feed more.
Okay.
And so the part of it has to do with the humidity and so on, that they're more active during that time.
Okay.
But I mean, I see midges, and I live in Randfontein all the time.
Yeah.
If I go for an outride, it's actually quite scary.
I spray my helmet now. That's my solution.
This time of year, they're everywhere, but it is better to, you know, to start a little bit later if you can. So even though I know you're busy riding, but it's better this time of year if you you know, don't take your horses out of the stable too early.
And then, are midges more active in stables or outside? I know it sounds like a very odd question, but obviously if you're outside, you know, that the horses are probably a bit more at risk, but they also get bitten in the stables. Again, hence the use of shade cloth and screens and everything else. Are they more attracted to like a warm, moist, stable environment?
Not necessarily. So there's, we also did studies like that, and Onderstepoort also did in Australia as well. So there's different species of Culicoides. So there's the Culicoides immunicola. So Culicoides immunicola. And then the other one is Culicoides boletinus. That's the most common horse sickness vectors in South Africa. And immunicola was traditionally thought not to enter stables.
Okay.
It doesn't mean they don't at all. Okay. But boletinus enter stables.
Okay.
And so immunicola breeds in like play areas, you know, so
wetlands,
soil, and so on, while boletinus breeds in cattle dung. And so it's always still a good idea to, you know, have good paddock control, you know, to control for that. But we did studies where we put traps outside of the stable. Okay. So typically you also put light traps outside and then inside. And the level is like millions more midges outside than inside. Okay, so it's really, even in unprotected stables. Okay. You know, there's really less inside the stables. However, they do enter. Yeah. Okay, and mosquitoes enter all the time. You get less outside, but mosquitoes are specifically, they actually go into homes to find people to go bite.
I'm one of those people.
So if you stable, it's still a good idea to use insect repellents and insecticides and do the you know, the shade cloth thing.
Okay. Yeah. And then my question on that. So I have fans in all my stables. Mm-hmm. As an added, like, I know personal anecdotal experience, when I sleep and there's mosquitoes, if I've got my fans running high, I seem to have less trouble. Yeah,
well, it's, you know, it's basically just you disrupt their flight pattern. Okay. And so midges are even lighter. Okay. You know, so the idea, there is science behind it, and it's a good idea. It's not easy always to have very good fans. So not everyone has, you know, it's good workable fans. And I mean, we've also seen decapitated doves and so on inside the stable. So it has plus and minuses. You need to make sure that it's safe as well.
Yes, yeah. I have one who likes to eat his fans. It brings me great joy. So he's got one suspended off almost the top of the ceiling in a corner.
Probably like a covered fan.
Yes.
You know, that has it's safe.
So I've got the industrial floor fans, so they're like sort of 50-centimeter ones that crank out. They do seem to work well. Okay, so that's on that. And then, so I suppose it's the same with West Nile, sort of, you know, in terms of the prevention of not getting the mosquitoes into the stables, essentially.
Yeah, and so West Nile, you know, there's more studies on humans. Okay. So on the CDC's website, you can actually go and look, and they recommend DEET is basically, you know, the safest way to protect it, or the most effective. There's also something called oil of lemon eucalyptus or something like that. Okay. That's also on their website. That's also, but is it called that? Sorry, oil of lemon something. Okay. But And so that's also, there was a stage where I actually saw that sold in Spar and so on. So it's not a essential oil, it's a, a well-developed system as well.
Okay.
And then apart from that, erythroids is actually used in the States to spray
everything.
Yeah. And so we don't do that here, but it is really effective for that, for mosquitoes as well. So both for you and for your animals.
For your animals.
So in general, you don't put erythroids on your skin because but you can put it on your clothes.
Yeah.
And so it's the same with the animal. It's on their fur.
Fur, not on their skin. Yeah. So you do, I suppose, have some horses that are a bit more reactive than others.
Yeah, there's, I find some of the products is also like they're almost more volatile. They make you cough more.
Yeah. Okay.
So you'll see, I've also seen people that say it causes neurological symptoms and so on. There were studies shown where they used highly concentrated in rats.
Okay.
They became neurological.
Okay.
It's not at these low levels.
Yeah.
Okay. But they do, in humans, don't recommend it to spray it on newborn babies.
Yes.
But the foal is probably already,
a little bit more developed.
Yeah, and there's as a high, mass. So it's not as dangerous as for a very small baby.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So in general, it's safe on animals.
Is there a time? I suppose it's a bit like malaria, that we're not ever going to see the end of horse sickness.
Horse sickness is endemic in South Africa. If we don't find, a much better vaccine, it will never go away. With the current vaccine, you must remember in the time that horse sickness was introduced or horses were introduced in the Cape, like in 1700, some of those, there were 100,000 horses that died.
Yeah.
They basically replaced horses in the Kruger Park every year because the horses died.
Yeah.
So it's basically, although it's not ideal, we would like to have an improved system. Without a vaccine, your horses are really, really very vulnerable, and I would never sleep if my horses weren't vaccinated.
But there's also been cases of it. I'm sure it was about 2 years ago, there was a case of horse sickness in Italy, but I think it came through with an infected zebra.
Yeah, so it was actually in Thailand.
Okay.
Yeah, so there was
slightly right.
Over the years, there's been a couple of outbreaks, in the Middle East, in Europe, and then most recently it was in Thailand. And it was after exporting zebras from Southern Africa, actually, that were kept there. And then, they had an outbreak of horse sickness after that. And it spread all the way to Malaysia. And they used the OBP vaccine to protect them, but all the horses were kept inside and protected from any midge activity.
Okay. And they've pretty much eradicated it.
They think so.
They think so.
Yeah, but it was basically, if it's small enough, you could do that.
Yeah.
Okay, but the problem is we have a reservoir host here. So both donkeys and zebras can be infected without seeing the disease.
So would there be, I know it sounds odd, would there be more of a risk if you had zebras and donkeys on your property of your horses contracting AHS?
Yes, in the sense that you don't see necessarily that they become sick.
Okay.
So if you keep donkeys, I would vaccinate the donkey as well.
Okay, so you can vaccinate donkeys.
Yeah, it's not. They don't vaccinate zebras in South Africa.
Okay,
that's a.
Would that a random question here? Would that be effective if we vaccinated all the zebras? Would it help?
It's hard to say. So the problem is because they don't actually show symptoms. You don't know when they're infected. May reduce the viral load in them, but it's impossible.
Yeah.
It's impossible to. So it's a very theoretical thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So if they have possibly it's something that could have been done, investigated in the Western Cape.
Yeah.
If they bring them in and they vaccinate it before they come in, that they're immune.
Yeah.
But that needs to be very well controlled. And the problem is, you need to do it annually. How do you get all the zebras round?
Yeah. No.
So
dark gun.
Yeah. So, but what happened in the Western Cape with those outbreaks, though, is typically, with the vaccine, if the vaccine coverage is low, then you can actually get vaccine spreading. Okay.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of outbreaks, 3 specifically, that was published, where it looks like the outbreak that happened in the Western Cape was due to vaccine that then were picked up by midges and reassorted and caused the outbreak. Those outbreaks had low pathogenesis, though. They had about a 10% fatality rate, which is typically, that's what raised the alarm. that must be a vaccine, because a normal horse sickness outbreak is a 90%
Yes.
fatality rate. And so if you, the problem in the Western Cape is because they can't vaccinate, you know, the chance, there's a higher risk of spreading.
Yeah.
While in the endemic zone, if horses were vaccinated, you know, the chance of spreading is lower.
Lower, okay.
But you need to then have it high enough.
Yeah.
So it's the same, you know, with human vaccines such as polio. So in countries where the vaccine coverage is low, the polio vaccine can spread.
Okay.
And then you can get virulent virus that basically...
They call it like wild polio, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
That's
called
slightly
vaccine.
different. Okay.
So wild polio is the actual polio virus, but you get vaccine-associated polio transmission. And that's when the polio vaccine can reassort then with other similar viruses that you call enteroviruses. And then you get a virulent virus again.
Wow.
But if the population is immune, they can't spread.
They can't spread.
While if it's not, then you get actually outbreaks.
So I think the entire thing is vaccinate your horses.
Yeah, if all the horses are immune, the chances of anything spreading, including wild type horse sickness, is lower. You know, so and that's just the reality of it. So it's, yes, it's true. You know, some vaccinated horses may still get sick. We do see that it's possible that the vaccine can spread. So ideally, the best control would be if you have a vaccine that can't spread, that can't reassort. But once again, it's not to say that those inactivated vaccines will necessarily work
be more effective.
We need more data.
Yeah.
There are groups in South Africa as well that actually works on inactivated vaccines, and so that's, you know, hope for us as well.
Yeah.
Bringing the other vaccine would be great.
Yeah.
But we would just like to know
need the research, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And why do you think we've had such a bad AHS season this year? Because I mean, I haven't remembered it being this bad for a long time.
It's just all the rain.
The rain.
Yeah. So I mean, it's been a exceptionally wet year, and it never stops.
No.
I mean,
well, the sun is shining outside, you know.
How many shows have been cancelled?
Well, yes.
So exactly. So this has just been a very wet year, and unfortunately also if the winters aren't cold enough, the midges don't get killed off.
Enough.
So even with West Nile, we've seen you can sometimes get cases in August, September. That's actually a midge or mosquito of the previous season, because it didn't get killed off during the cold winter. So we must all just pray for a very cold winter.
Yes. I don't know if I want one. I don't like the cold that much. Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. Any other add-ons?
No, thank you for the discussion. And, you know, something to remember, just if your horse gets sick, okay, it doesn't mean it's horse sickness. Equine encephalosis has, you know, many different serotypes as well.
Yeah.
And it can present the same as horse sickness, and it can present the same as West Nile. So it can actually be neurological or pulmonary.
Yeah.
And then all these other viruses that co-circulate, you know, can present similar signs as West Nile as well.
Yeah.
So if you don't have your horse tested, you know, you wouldn't know.
Yeah.
And that's why it's still, you know, the best practice, if your horse gets sick, that it actually get tested, be confirmed. Yeah. And that then you can actually implement some control as well and warn people around you.
Yeah. You know, so and I think that's the thing. People seem a little reticent to disclose it. You know what I mean? It seems to be there's a little bit of a stigma, you know, and we're all trying our best. But to my mind, for the benefit of the community, it's far better to disclose, to be practical and not take your horses out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also, you know, I've seen lots of strange donations where people say, no, I don't take the vaccine from other people, so I don't vaccinate my horses because they don't travel that much. It's nonsense. You should vaccinate. Everyone should vaccinate. And so it is a problem with the vaccine shortage, but in general, if you plan ahead and you book your vaccine and you make sure that you have vaccine, you know, still try to find it and vaccinate.